battles just happening as we go along. Now, as this climactic battle happens, and we have this incredible kind of clash that occurs right when all of the champions gather together, and then there's this kind of huge war almost that sort of for want of a better term, with a whole bunch of bloodshed and a whole bunch of murder. It's war. A whole bunch of conflict, and as all these souls departing departing their bodies, and all of this kind of violence eventually builds up so much psychic energy with this one massive outpouring. Once again, the champions achieve their final forms. They become the gods themselves, and they actually ascend to the heavens. And at this point, they then go and populate the celestial court once more, and they return, and they exist as, the similar sort of gods that you would expect them to have existed as before. They are the gods of war. They are the gods of trickery, they are the gods of knowledge, and so forth. Now, in the mortal planes, they rain blessings upon their followers. They're very benevolent. They exist now as the gods that they've been striving to become, and they follow their people. Now, in terms of the actual mortal planes below, they now exist in a sort of period of tranquility. This is something where they no longer have to worry about this idea that of kind of conflict in their planet anymore. Everyone is happy. There's this great peace that sort of stretches out across the world. And for a time there is happiness. For a time the gods are content to sort of sit in the celestial courts, and they're content to watch over what happens with watch over the mortal realms. And all of the nations and all of the races thrive and continue to exist. Until, of course, time continues and we find, much as in our own history, the races begin to move towards secular thought again. The miracles are less common as the gods begin to lose interest in the sort of petty squabbles of mortals, because of every passing moment they are even more detached as they begin to sort of, have their own concerns within the celestial court. They're no longer connected to the mortal planes in the way they once were. They are no longer mortal flesh. And as time goes on, the miracles no longer sort of seem to exist. The actual sort of memory of these actual champions begins to fade increasingly for hundreds, thousands. Again, depends on the cycle itself. Years, this existence sort of really disappears. And we then find ourselves back once again to where we started off, where the mortals have abandoned them. And at that point, that's when the god's power begins to ebb and begins to wane. And too late, once more the cycle begins. And as we've already decided, then we go back around to the start. The gods begin to shatter and smash down to the earth. And that's really what is an age of Godtear. It's this cyclical existence where you always have this idea that the sort of ages are always observed. There is always a period where the world is destroyed and reduced to sludge. The races emerge, the ones that survived, of course. Some of them don't, and that's obviously a good point we can get onto. And then we have the point where we have the rise of the chosen, who then become the champions, who then go forth. They then sort of form armies. They conflict. They go across in this conquest to find the different god tiers. Eventually, they ascend and become actual champions themselves. And then eventually we move to a stage where the actual mortals begin to abandon them for whatever reason. The gods begin to be destroyed, crash down to the earth again as god tiers, and the whole thing begins once more. And that's really our universe of how Godtear works. That's really what it is. Now, the current age, as we've said, is the 11th age. So we've had several of these already passed. This is something where this is not the first time it's happened. It's not the second time or third time and so on. There's been plenty of before, and each of the ages tends to have had its own history, had its own existence happened. Races were born into various different races, into different ages of this, usually in the guise of the gods that created them. Our initial races that we originally had, for example, in the Golden Age, the time when the original gods, the Eidolon gods existed, were simply elves and dragons. And it wasn't until towards the end of this period that other races began to come in. And over time, different races have existed and been destroyed, or reduced to such a number that they believe they're sort of a myth almost within the universe of Godtear. We've also seen different levels of civilization. We've seen different levels of technology build up. You can easily envision, for example, and this isn't canon, this is me for sort of speculating out there, we could have had an age where actually the mortal realms got really very far along. They actually got to the stage where they potentially even could have got to a similar level to what we actually have now in our own society. Alternatively, they could have got as far as medieval times before that was actually destroyed, or even not even as advanced as that. So there's an awful lot of variance built in. There's an awful lot of rich kind of fertile ground for us to explore and for us to see if we were to actually go and sort of deep dive in to how the actual universe looks. So with that said, I'm now going to have a quick look at the stream. Hopefully that sort of explained a few things for you and see where we are at in terms of questions, because I don't know I have anything right now. Hopefully I can see something. I think my chat is a little bit behind, so do drop these bits in. He says, hoping to see some questions soon. Okay. Well, in the meantime, I can talk a little bit, while I wait for some questions to appear, perhaps I can talk a little bit about about the Eidolon gods. And I can talk a little bit about the initial version of how the Godtear universe looked, for those of you. So, in the beginning there were these impulses, is the best way to describe them. In the beginning there are these ideas, these incredibly sort of celestial beings that existed, where they kind of existed as this raw power that's kind of permeated across the land, it's just in this ethereal space. And as time went on, they began to form these actual ideas, these sentients themselves. And as this happened, they then looked upon what they had, which is space and just this raw area, and decided, let's see if we can begin to and at this point these gods, as they became these Eidolon gods, as they became known, really sort of started to build up the universe itself. Now, this is when they created the actual mortal realm. This is when we started to see mountains and streams and oceans and all sorts appear. And the initial races they created were the dragons. The dragons were saturated with holy power. They were the angels, effectively, of the Eidolon gods. They were the creatures that really kind of were the first ones to exist and marshal nature to how the actual universe existed and how the universe looked in the eyes of these pure Eidolon gods. Now, once time goes on, they then created the Elves, and the Elves were designed as the wardens of this universe. The Elves were designed to exist in a way whereby they were really if the dragons were the angels who sort of really passed on the message of the Eidolon gods to their people, then the Elves are the wardens. They are responsible for maintaining the universe itself. They are the most closest to this vision of sort of this perfect kind of being, almost, in the eyes of the original closest thing to the Eidolon gods themselves. Because obviously every god will make a race in its own visage at some point. Now, then there was a great betrayal. Many, many years continue, and there's happiness, but the Golden Ages eventually ended when the gods began to create other races to list alongside the Elves. And this is the stage where the Elves really rebelled, and the various different sects of the Elves chose that actually, they didn't want to share this universe. They didn't want to share the mortal realms with other races, and they began to attack and kill the new races and just drive them from the lands. And at this point, the gods voiced their displeasure, and the angels, the dragons, began to attack them. And this is really what leads to the great sort of the end of the first cycle, the Golden Age. And this is when we start to see this huge warfare that the Elves, of course, have no hope possibly of winning. For every dragon they destroy, there's no way they can, there's thousands of Elves are destroyed by this. And so eventually the Elves have to stop. The elves lose this war, but in doing so, the gods themselves have now come into conflict. The gods don't agree with what's happened here. This has created this own level of animosity in the Celestial Court. This has created its own conflict, and this actually then results in the first war of the gods in the Celestial Court, and this is what causes the first great reign of Godtear, when the gods themselves are attacking each other and lashing each other with this sort of with this sort of spiritual power, and really destroying each other, and that's what cracks them up, and that's what destroys them in the first chance. Until the very last gods that exist in the Celestial Court look down and weep because they see the destruction they've wrought to the mortal realms below them. They see the fact that the dragons, sort of almost divorced from this sort of connection of power, have begun to sort of, become mortal at last. This idea that the elves themselves have almost been destroyed, and this idea that their beautiful paradise that they created has been literally annihilated by their own actions. And this is the stage where we then effectively see at the end of the first stage, and the Godtear cycle really begins. And that's where this idea that champions who ascend to the Celestial Court aren't ever truly themselves, they're always a Gestalt entity. The Eidolon gods were the pure instances of gods, and they no longer exist in this universe. The only way that the gods exist now is the way that they've almost been polluted by the actual champions themselves. So, let's have a quick look at some of the questions. I see a whole bunch of these coming in now. So, how many cycles have passed in which we're playing the game now? I think I already answered this. There's about 11 or so. Just a quick apology, by the way. It looks like the lore stream went down a little bit for there. I don't know whether that's something we can catch up or not. Hopefully you guys didn't miss too much. So yeah, so I think we're 11 cycles, if memory serves, on this one now. There's a lot of discussion in the internal team. A guy called Richard August, who's relatively new to our team, but well, I say relatively new since last year now, but he and I have gone around an awful lot of times, bouncing around different ideas. And the truthful answer is that there's not too much in terms of, we've deliberately left it quite a slightly grey area. As in the sense that we want enough time to have elapsed that are different, that we can have lots of stories, lots of history, lots of sort of backstory going on within the universe itself, which we can make official. But at the same time, we also want there to be enough grey areas that you guys, when you're actually playing your campaigns and playing your actual games, can really almost latch onto and make your own. Part of the best thing about playing any campaign game is this idea that you're making your own history, or sort of coming up with your own ideas. And it's worth stressing that because of the way the age system works, the ages, there's no reason why it could be that your games of Godtear represent the most up-to-date recent age, and let's say that's the 11th age, as we've set. If that's the 11th age, then there's no reason why it can't be that you're actually playing your games and you decide, you know what, this happens in the 5th age, and this is, the world looks very different. There's lots of different stuff where you guys can really take control of it, which is cool. So, thank you, 10k Painting Paul. Glad you like it. It says the Godtear lore is amazing. Unfortunately, Matt, I can't give you a list of all the ages of their names, purely because of just what I've said there. Matt Knott says, can we get a list of the ages of their names? I can't give you a full list of these, purely for the reasons I've just discussed. Obviously we have different ages. There's the age, for example, of iron, which is the one where the dwarves first appear, and they are tasked by the gods of creating this wondrous new metal. There's the age of pestilence, which is where the undead curse first begins, and we know the god of death creates this curse that goes across the land. And then, of course, we have other things. The age, the Forgotten Age, which is the one where, again, the very little really exists from that. It's a very short age where the world doesn't ever truly get out of. It's ended very, very quickly by a very specific set of events that I'm not going to spoil too much just now. So that's that. Of the current champions, who's the most powerful per the lore? At this stage, because we're the start. Sorry, it says it's burger time. So at this stage where we're starting out, we have this idea that all of the champions are more or less equal. They've all had one, maybe two god tiers at most, and they are really emerging into the universe as the actual gods themselves. And no god tier inherently is more powerful than another one. So I'd say they're more or less equal at this stage, but of course that's up for you guys to tell the story of as you actually play games, as your campaigns play out, as different champions sort of take control, as it were, of different god tiers and begin to sort of grow more powerful and so on. This is what you're really telling. This is the story you're doing. So, yeah, that's really sort of up to you guys to really sort of tell us who you think they are. The only sort of couple that it's worth mentioning, because they purely exist outside of that, is Shale, who's a very interesting champion. Shale is a champion who actually doesn't choose not to absorb god tiers. So in this sense, Shale is probably one of the weaker champions, in the sense that, unlike, say, Rangosh, for example, who immediately upon finding his first god tier rams it into his chest and kind of begins to absorb the god tier that way, instead we kind of have Shale, who instead sees himself as a guardian. Shale's philosophy is very much that the mortals shouldn't have the power of the gods at their fingertips, and as a result shapes living rock around a god tier, in this case Landslide, to protect it, to protect the god tier from being taken, or protect the god tier from being stolen by any sort of other mortal. It's almost like guardians. So every time Shale encounters a new god tier, he'll create a new warden for that god tier. So in that sense, I guess you probably could argue that Shale is less powerful than the other champions, although I think we can all disagree on that in terms of the actual rules and so on, because crucially we never create a champion that's in the game that's not powerful enough to sort of stand up with the others. But it's really worth understanding from a lore perspective. Shale's energy, Shale's magic comes from a slightly different place than the others. The other one is Mournblade, who's a very interesting character. Mournblade is a champion of old, because one thing that happens, and I should stress this with the actual god tier champions as they have their trials and they fight to gain different god tiers, is some of them inevitably are destroyed along the way. There is this time, as the champions begin to gather larger armies, as they begin to search out, that all of the god tiers have actually been discovered, and now the new god tiers they need to claim are actually part of another champion. And at this point the champions really do go to war. The sort of war bands that we're familiar with really break up, and at that stage we then have these sort of titanic clashes between these armies, where the victor will literally destroy the opposing champion and wrest all of the power from them and claim it as their own. Now, Mournblade is a good example of one of those champions. Mournblade is a champion who was destroyed in a previous age, and unlike others who normally would, unlike other champions who would just waste away into nothingness, Mournblade has such a powerful sentience in him that he really persisted, crawled into the darkest, deepest sort of part of the earth, and began to restore his power, little bit by little, over thousands and thousands of years, until eventually he had enough to actually form himself this sort of revenant body and begin to emerge once more, to actually then pursue the actual god tier once more as a champion. And that, I think, is possibly a really interesting statement about, does that make Mournblade more powerful? Maybe. I think it's more so much about, in terms of the actual will to survive, this sort of sense of this ability to survive beyond death. That certainly makes Mournblade very unique compared to the others. So let's have a look. Blue Tax, does this hint for a larger scale game, or will we hopefully stay at this level of conflicts? So that's an interesting question. One thing we always talked about, Matt and I, when we were first thinking of the lore for God Tier especially, and then later on with design stuff as well, although more lore at this point, is God Tier is a game that is a universe that can exist at many different levels. We could have a skirmish version of God Tier. We could have God Tier as it is here. You could even have God Tier as this this incredible sort of tiny, for those of historical gamers out there or remember older games, like tiny sort of scale, 5-6 mil infantry kind of running around these huge armies. Any Epic fans out there would probably appreciate that kind of sense, where we would have that. So God Tier really can step up and really expand in many different ways as a universe. I wouldn't like to predict at the future. Obviously, one thing we're all extremely excited about is God Tier, the game as we know it now. It's an awful lot of fun to play, and it's something where I think, talking about another game that may follow or expanding out the universe and so on feels a little bit further down the line, when we're really just beginning to explore and have an awful lot of fun with what the game is now. But at the same time, of course, never say never, right? Peter O'Sullivan wants to know if Minotaurs are a sentient race. Absolutely. We haven't really seen too much of them just yet, but they are absolutely a sentient race. Let's have a look. What else do we have? Can you let us know about any of the races that may not have champions? Sure. I mean, we've deliberately designed the God Tier universe to be extremely open. So there's lots of ideas about what type of races exist out there. So we know, for example, there are beastmen. We know that there are kobolds out there. We know that there are what other races? I mean, there's obviously different types of humans in terms of sort of tribal, kind of really primitive, basic humans out there, which aren't really part of any of the sort of civilized nations that you see in the Godtear map in the rulebook. There are also other things out there in terms of gnomes. For example, we haven't seen any sort of gnomes, or we haven't seen any fairies, or we haven't sort of delved too much into the Fey folk yet, for example. So there's an awful lot of different races, I think, that over time we can happily explore. I mean, it might even be that we actually start seeing some sort of sentient golems at some point, or all sorts. There's kind of an interesting argument that maybe there could be a point where you could even have a follower themselves who actually usurps their own champion. Now, we know that we've already got quite a wide variety of different followers that don't necessarily match their champions, so that could be kind of fun. I'm personally holding out for, and this isn't any sort of confirmation, it'd be really awesome if one of Rattlebone's totems suddenly became a champion, because that would just be amusing, and that would cause me all sorts of weird Zelda vibes, I think. It's like the Deku tree. So, 10k painting 4. Are we going to see any fire elves and other versions of the Dragonkin, not necessarily in the game, in the lore? So, for those of you who've not heard me talking about Godtear lore before, the elves really exist in 4 different sects. Now, those are, roughly speaking, ones who follow one of each of the main elements. Now, the Pyri, the fire elves, were the chief orchestrators of the sort of great betrayal that occurred against the gods themselves. They were the most warlike sect, and they were the ones that fought against the ancient dragons and the gods in the very start of time itself, in the Golden Age, and as a result were very much largely destroyed and sort of really stricken from the earth itself. Now, whether any practitioners of this remained, whether they're sort of ancient secrets in some ruin somewhere that subsisted over the eras or the ages, whether this is something where this is a cult that somehow managed to avoid detection, is a really interesting question. Not presently, we don't have any existence of this. Maybe we could. I mean, again, this is really something where the Godtear universe is really sort of building upwards at this stage, and we're really telling stories with the aid of you guys as part of our campaigns. So it may well be that we can find some ancient secrets and kind of see the rebirth of this sect. Or alternatively, maybe it sort of becomes this forbidden magic that is never returned to. Either way, I don't think that we've seen the last of the actual. I don't think we've seen the last of it as an element within our storytelling. Whether that's actually something that exists as an actual race is an interesting question. And actual fire elves themselves is an interesting question. So there seems to be so much scope for. So Paul, again, 10k painting Paul. There seems to be so much scope to create your own style of champion and followers. Is there any scope for custom characters? I mean, arguably, you're kind of already doing that in the campaign mode of the game anyway. You're taking an existing character and you're really building on it in the way that you want to do. In terms of actually creating a sort of true, almost like a list building kind of point system, I don't know, that feels very much against, I don't want to get too much into game design discussion, but I will say that kind of feels very much against the normal run of how you would have Godtear, which is very much designed as a super accessible, super straightforward, grab your models and then really sort of put them down the table. Like, I love the fact that with Godtear that I could happily have a game with any one of you in the chat by simply saying, hey, we're playing a game, awesome, how many champions? 3, okay, great, grab 3 out of my bag, put them on the table, and we're good to go. We don't need to, at this stage, then really kind of look at this and go, okay, so how many points do we want to play? And then sort of sit there with a list, kind of going over different upgrades, for example, and that sort of stuff. It's really streamlined and designed to just get everyone playing on the table straight away as quickly as they can, and I think that might go slightly counterintuitively towards that. It also obviously introduced different balance concerns and all sorts. So one for us, perhaps one for Steve Markinson to have a listen to, or for us to sort of expand on a little bit more. But because I want to stay purely in the realm of lore at this point, I don't necessarily want to get too far into that. So Redmore69, I'm looking to butcher. I'm probably going to butcher the terminology, but when the gods fall, is there a chance of them returning to gather more followers and regain power, or do they just die? So when the gods fall, when the reign of the gods, when the god tier reign really happens, the gods are literally destroyed. They crack and they shatter into thousands of pieces and rain down. At this point, any sentience they have is really stored in, stored across all of these different god tiers. They no longer can sort of, leave the mortal realm and then go back. The process why they return to the celestial court is really via the champions themselves. That's the path for the gods to return, effectively, and that's pretty much what god tier is. So I'm afraid not so much. No sort of retconning or fixing. No rewind button for the gods, I'm afraid. 10k Penning Pool. Will we ever see another gnome? Maybe. I don't know the answer to that one. I mean, certainly gnomes exist in our universe, so absolutely. It's not something where, as I've already alluded to with the Fey folk, it's not something where the gnomes have all died out. Maybe, or even if they had, I mean, there's no reason why we can't have a race that seems to be destroyed and then somehow appears after a gap of an age or something else along those lines. But yeah, I don't see why we wouldn't have another gnome, but obviously anything we introduce into the game, we'd want to introduce it for a purpose rather than just having a cool gnome character. So, John Bucket, how do the existing champions view each other? Is there any specific rivalries or animosity between particular champions? That's a really good question. I think you could happily say that there's going to be. It's really down for you guys to sort of tell the stories of what the champions you think. But I can envision off the top of my head and a thing that doesn't feel like too much of a jump. I wouldn't necessarily see Rangosh being buddies with too many people at all, for example, nor Mournblade. But then at the same time, I could happily see a grudging respect existing between Titus and quite a few other champions, depending on their actual nature themselves and roughly where their loyalties and their alignment would fall. Any champion that you might fall under lawful good, for example, I could happily see being allied with somebody else of a similar sort of alignment, or even neutral, and generally being quite happy with them. I could happily see the Dwarven champions not really having too much animosity towards each other. By comparison, I could see the Orc champions existing with very little other than sort of grudging respect, and that's about it. So maybe that's something where we can begin to explore that as we go along. One thing we could also look at doing is creating alliances or covenants or all sorts of things. So these are questions for later on, as we sort of start to tell stories and as we start to build up this stuff. So let's have a quick look. Has society remained mostly underground given the cycles of destructions? So not really. It's worth understanding that each of the ages, because of the total annihilation that occurs, and because of the gaps between the point where the sort of survivors crawl out into the world and in terms of generations pass off them, it's almost like previous ages to the actual inhabitants of the mortal realms are almost fables. They're all legends. They're myths. They're actually something where they're these kind of idea that, if you can envision like the humans that crawl out as a survivor from into the current age from the previous one, there's several generations of them. There's probably not a single man, woman, or child existing among them who remember the previous age by the time they start building up society again. By the time they start creating things, life for these people is very hard. These are periods where we actually have, these are things where these people would die, and it's really sort of, legends that are sort of told down the ages and so on. And it's something where they wouldn't know just how many ages have passed. They wouldn't have this idea of what has happened before, why it is they existed. Almost to the point where we actually get to the stage where we have champions, and the stage where we actually have armies and so forth, and we really start to see the birth of civilization in full terms. At that stage, it would seem a very distant kind of legend to these people that, oh yes, the world was destroyed by the fall of these god tiers and so forth. This isn't something that exists. We're talking about a process that takes place over hundreds and thousands of years. So it really is something where there's not really this conscious decision of, well, this reign of gods keeps happening, why don't we build underground and exist that way? That said, we know that some races, dwarves being a notable example, tend to build inside of mountains and so on. So it's also fairly safe to assume that there's all sorts of interesting lore and all sorts of interesting deep, dark depths, kind of caverns and so forth, and forgotten holds that probably exist, which might have secrets about previous ages and might actually sort of lend other races this idea and this knowledge of what sort of happened in the past. Corey, You've talked about backstory for each individual champion, i.e. Mournblade. Will this be published somewhere sometime soon? Interesting question. One of the things that we're always looking to do to talk about with Godtear is obviously there's an awful lot of lore and a lot of story, as you can tell from the way I'm talking about it, that's built into what these built into the actual game itself. One of the ways that we're always looking is the best way to deploy that for people. Obviously, our Guild Ball fans know that we have a very specific way of doing that in terms of seasons and story arcs and so on. And I don't think that's the right way for Godtear to be deployed. Godtear, by nature itself, is more a land of fables. It's more a land of legends and heroism. And it's also something where you have this idea that, again, because it's a campaign game, because it's really, we put a lot of the action into the hands of the actual players themselves, you're almost telling the stories, you're telling the legends and so forth. So there is something where we almost want to have you guys tell us, this is what we think Rangosh is like. This is what Rangosh has done through the various different campaigns. This is how we're going to shape the universe itself, and that gives more power to you rather than us sort of dictating, this is the exact backstory. I'd be much more comfortable putting out, for example, a legend of Rangosh, where we create Rangosh as this brutal tyrant in the Shattered Plains, and then the idea is he exists there, roaming around this kind of this kind of creature that is almost a fable in that particular part, in the Borderlands or wherever else they're trying to repel him from. Like, Rangosh may appear with a giant army of followers to attack you, so always fear Rangosh. That sort of idea. I wouldn't ever possibly want to go that much further, because at that point I think it gives players much more interaction with our actual fiction, with our lore and our universe. So that's pretty much it. Now, how the best way of deploying that stuff is an interesting question. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's online, maybe it's to make a hub like we have our Guild Ball hub. That one's really still open for discussion with us as to what we would see and the best way to deploy it, so that way it reaches the most people and you guys can have the most interactivity and enjoyment out of it. So a quick look. Is touch right now? Looks like you've already answered those questions, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. Cheers, Redmore. Cheers for the answer. Any leakable lore for the doggos? So that'd be dungeon doggies. I'm afraid I can't help you on that one, purely because that one you'd need to really speak to Russ, our sculptor. I don't get too involved with the dungeon doggies. For those of you who know my lore from the Godtear, from Guild Ball, and you're probably getting a sense from Godtear, given the amount of destruction and death that we're already talking about with this, that's not really something you apply too many times to cute innocent doggies and cats. So I think Russ is a little bit scared what would happen if I started writing stories for dungeon doggies. So there we are. Peter O'Sullivan, what is my favourite champion and why? Firstly, hi Peter, nice to see you here. Thank you very much for your kind words on Twitter. It's awesome seeing you how enthusiastic you are for the project. My favourite champion, really interesting question. Personally, I am a fairly... My current roster of champions that I normally tend to run with are Titus, Finvar, and then Rattlebone. So with that in mind, it's probably one of those guys, I suspect. You're kind of asking me to choose which one is my favourite child in a lot of ways. I always have this with Guild Ball when people ask me about, do I have a favourite guild? Usually the answer when I'm talking about Guild Ball is whichever guild it is that I'm currently writing about, because I just generally get quite involved with those ones, and then at that point I kind of find lots of different points where I can really sort of really associate with them or really inject a lot of life into them, or that's my main focus. So I think probably one of those guys for the time being. That said, I like Titus. I'll stick with Titus purely because of the three. I'll narrow myself down to that. I like Titus at all because, for those of you who don't know his backstory, Titus is one of our more likeable champions, is the best way of describing him. So Titus is an individual from a very hard land, a human realm called the Borderlands, who are ruled by the Sanguine Princes, this enigmatic and very noble race that no one has really, or these humans I should say, that no one's ever really seen anything of too much. They live in these incredible sort of fortresses built on the edge of the Shattered Plains, this area where it's really just a wilderness. And it's the task of all the people in the Borderlands to hold back any creatures, beastmen, kobolds, minotaurs, anything that crawls out of the wastes to attack the civilized realm. And they exist there as sentinels. Now, as a result, they're a very warlike society, and Titus is a commander of an army and a garrison that is basically stationed along the borderlands, and marches out to basically encounter, to basically out on a patrol one fine day, and discovers that his army is arrayed against a massively superior force. Like, imagine an uprising of hundreds of thousands of enemies, and simply knows that he cannot win. And at this stage, really kind of says, well, that's fine. We'll retreat back to the garrison. We'll obviously have a siege, and we'll hold the line against the orders of the Sanguine Princes. The Sanguine Princes order that it's very much a very honor-bound society, and it's simply you will die fighting if you need to, to serve the realm. And Titus refuses to do that. Titus is very much honor-bound to kind of protect his people and protect the men and women under his command, rather than waste his life unnecessarily. Now, once the siege is broken, and once the actual enemy are then disbanded, Titus then is dragged to the capital and is court-martialed and stripped of any rank and stripped of any vestments, and then basically thrown into the fighting pits, thrown to this huge coliseum, and told the only way you will have freedom is by fighting and defeating anything that we throw at you. And the expectation is that Titus will just be destroyed. And at this stage, of course, Titus isn't a champion. Titus is just a standard human. So Titus stands for a full day and night fighting anything that they array against him, to the point where the bloodthirsty, baying crowds actually, at this time, are now no longer cheering for his death, but actually cheering for his survival. He wins them over. They start off very much, screaming traitor, that he's a betrayer, that Titus has abandoned them all. This very much hate-fuel kind of hate in their hearts, because he is an honor-bound society, and he is an oath-breaker. He has turned against his own people in that he's disobeyed orders. It's literally that sort of level of almost indoctrination amongst the border princes, the borderlands. But Titus stands tall and fights off all of these different enemies, until eventually the only thing left to the Sanguine Princes is just to expel him, because it's obvious that nothing can bring him down. And then, of course, as time goes on and Titus leaves, and some of his followers actually leave with him, they abandon their post to go with him, he then discovers that he is actually one of the chosen, absorbs a Godtear, and now, although he's not returned to the human realms yet, is roaming a relentless search for Godtear in order, and this is an interesting point about champions. As they begin to, obviously their natures change, as they absorb different champions, as they absorb different Godtear. It may well be that Titus starts out and wants to very much very much wants to protect his people, protect protect humanity from the predations of other races. But it may well be that as he absorbs more Godtear and starts to understand the world in a different way, starts to have whispers of gods from the past whisper to him, starts to understand the world from a very much different perspective, maybe his focus switches and changes. And that's really, again, down to you guys to sort of really tell the story. What's interesting is that I have a very set idea from my head for where Titus is at. You all may well do from your own games, have a different idea of where Titus is coming from. Maybe when I sort of started building him, and I don't honestly remember Titus's campaign paths, but I think one is quest. So I may have built him along the campaign path of quest, and then let's assume the other one is knowledge. It may well be that you guys prefer the knowledge path. Well, at that point, that's a very different nature that we're giving to Titus, and I think that's part of the interesting part about it. I can tell you so far what I think my favourite champion is and why. You may have exactly the same champion. Tell me he's your favourite, or they are your favourite, but at the same time, it could be for very different reasons to mine, and I think that's really awesome. So let's have a quick look. Corey, fair point about stories going forward. What you've described as the backstory is interesting. The legend idea is what I think I'm looking for. Sure, I mean, I appreciate that's probably in relation. I imagine that's in relation to the. I feel like that's in relation to the idea of how we might put the stories out and so on. And I understand. I don't think, as said, I think the legend route is really cool, and it's really a case of we need to find the best way of deploying that. The last thing I'd want to do is for us to put it out and then have everybody searching for, through different internet forums or Facebook or whatever else, social media, to try and find various different sort of misthreads of information here and there. So it's really a case of understanding the best way to do it in a concise way, and also to reach the audience in the best way possible. So watch this space. Discussions of that are still going forward. Once we actually know, we'll definitely let you guys know. Redwall69, sorry, I meant Regnerus. Okay, so so that's in relation to the Dungeon Doggies question. So Dungeons and Doggies are obviously something slightly different. Regnerus are the followers of a new champion whose name I'm not going to use just in case we haven't told you yet. He says, desperately trying to rack his memory and understand whether we have or not, whether we've actually said that. So the Regnerus, there's not really too much story I can tell you at this stage for them. They are followers of the Undead Champion, and they are sort of his hounds, as it were. If you guys haven't seen them, they are they're kind of impossibly cute, in the sense that there's a Regnerus puppy, which is a follower for an Undead Champion, which is forthcoming, which is insanely cute. We actually made an enamel badge of a little while back. I can happily tell you that when Regnerus grow larger, they are a little bit more scary and nowhere near as cute. More likely to tear your face off than anything else. So, but yeah, there's not too much backstory to those, because most of our focus tends to be built around the actual champions themselves versus their actual followers, if that makes sense. So, I'm having a quick look. I'm not seeing too many other questions. Sorry if I need to wait for things to catch up here. I think that looks like the last one of the ones I've got. So, while I wait for anything else to come in, and hopefully it will do in a second, I can happily pass on that we've had the banner vote has been closed, and there's a very, very clear winner, which is Lorsan. So, congratulations to anybody who voted for Lorsan and wanted to see her banner appear, in terms of what Tom Lishman, our sculptor, is doing a little bit later on. So those of you who aren't familiar with, after I'm done, I think in about an hour or so's time now, I'm sorry if that's not quite right, we have another live stream going on, which will have my colleague Tom, who's an incredibly talented sculptor, who's actually putting together a banner, and that'll be for Lorsan. It looks like you guys all voted for it and chose that one, so well done. And I'm looking forward to that, because I love the banner design stuff. I think it's interesting, knowing our sculpting team, so much attention to detail goes into everything that they do, in terms of, it's the storytelling. Like, every single one of our banners isn't just a case of, oh, we need an orc banner, so just put some skulls on a stick kind of vibe. There's always storytelling to go with it. If I look at, in fact, as I sit and look at my shelf, I can see Blackjaw's banner from where I'm sitting here, and I can tell there's a bunch of dwarven shields and weapons sort of lashed to it, where we know that Blackjaw has attacked and raided several different dwarf outposts, for example. There's all sorts of storytelling going on every single one of our banners. So so we can have that. So a couple more questions coming in. It sounds like champions have had these big impactful moments. Is that part of the reason why they're able to touch the god tiers? So the idea of the chosen is that they are simply is almost destined to be an individual is born and destined to be a chosen. It's not really something where this heroic moment has sort of defined them, as much as they have really kind of come into existence, this way, and whether sort of it's this latent power within. The exception, of course, to that is Grimgut, who is very much a princeling who is desperate to absorb the power of a god tier, and basically and become a champion itself, and be chosen as a moment of status, because of his incredible jealousy he feels, and as a result consumes the god tier that is breaks into a vault with a god tier and consumes it. And that's really what turns god tier from this beautiful princeling into this sort of really disgusting, rotting mess, where somehow, much like Mournblade, will alone is and this sort of twisted energy inside is really what's keeping him going, but is really sort of is building out that way. So I'm afraid not in that sense. Do god tiers have some form of intelligence that gives them the ability to choose? So I'd say it's very much, there's a sentience within the god tiers themselves, and it's really a siren call to everybody, to every chosen around. Now, and in a slightly more obscure part of our lore, or slightly more going back a few ages, in the first few cycles, in the first few ages, there's this idea that the champions are only attracted to, or only sort of, the only siren song they hear is the god tiers that resonate and match their own. If you can envision, they almost have this point where a champion that has absorbed a god tier from the god of war absorbs the power into themselves, and then at that stage they then they wouldn't care for a god tier from the god of life. It's simply not really the path they would choose, and it's no longer something where they want to absorb all of those things. But at this stage, you would really have, at this stage in time, there's a point where I am trying to avoid too many spoilers with this, but there's a point in one of the ages where, as a result of a trickster god, I'll leave it there, god tiers begin to actually attract, or begin to resonate all at a similar sort of level. And at that point, you then have champions who can then absorb multiple god tiers from multiple gods. And at that point, it's interesting because we start to see a new pantheon of gods emerge. And that's very much happened in the past of our universe, and that's where our current god tiers are at. So, yes and no is the answer to that question. Christopher Bates, is Wraith Myrid a dragon? Can you talk about dragons? I absolutely can. Wraith Myrid is dragonkin. So let's talk a little bit about that race, because that's kind of interesting. So if you have listened to the stream for a little bit and listened to me waffle for too long so far, the dragons were the first chosen race of the Eidolon gods, the original gods. They were the angels, and they were these immortal creatures that existed and were filled with divine energy. And once the gods themselves had fallen, once the first fall of the gods had happened and crashed into the earth, and the second age began, the dragons realised that not only had some of their number been destroyed by the conflict with the elves, but also as their powers began to fail them because the celestial court was no longer sustaining them. Now, as a result, they realised that they would have to increasingly disappear off into slumber. They would have to crawl into the sort of dark places of the universe and sort of sleep eternally. Now, what they did instead, because they still felt that some race needed to be marshals and needed to be wardens of the universe, was to create their own race. They decided to break their sacred oath to the gods and create a race themselves who would exist in their stead. This is the dragonkin. Now, dragonkin were always designed to be creatures that existed independently of the power of the gods. They were much closer to mortals, and each of them followed from one of their sires. So Wraith Myrid, for example, his distant sire would have been Myrid, the great dragon Myrid. And in terms of how they came into being, this great sorcerer spell, using up the last of the dragon's energy, really created this race, but in doing so, created the curse of the chosen. So I think this is something I've not really talked about before. So that's really what creates the first time that we start to see the actual chosen. It's an unexpected side effect of the spell that creates the dragonkin race. This is something that none of the long since passed into the history of our universe. None of the actual characters or races inside would know this. But that's really what's created this idea that that's how the path of the chosen can exist. It's through the magic that was unleashed into the world, creating the dragonkin by the dragons themselves. And after this, of course, the dragons fall into their slumber, with only a handful of them still existing, or broken out of that as the ages go on. Now, there's an interesting question, of course, is where does that leave us with Kira and her dragons, and we'll perhaps get into that another time, so I don't want to too many spoilers for that one. Mythic Fox, have I read Stranger of the Tempest by J. Villiers? I hope that's pronounced the right way, and was it inspiration for the lore? I have not, so I'm not familiar with that in the slightest, Mythic Fox, so sorry. So yeah, so it looks like we've just about finished up. That's our hour of stuff. I was actually expecting whether you guys would ask me some Guild Ball questions, but that's cool. I'm sure I can find more time to do that another time. Thank you very, very much for everybody for attending and listening. It's been really, really cool of you. If I've missed any questions, obviously there's a slight lag, as you will have worked out on my questions on my feed. Perhaps social media is a good place to ask those questions. I'll see what I can do in terms of getting answers out to you. I am talking to some of our guys in our marketing team, so I could actually do a bit of a lore thing. Obviously, all of us at the moment across the world are in various stages of lockdown or whatever else. So I'm having a chat with them, see if there's anything we can do in terms of other lore bits and pieces. So if we can, watch this space, I'll try and do that, because I know there's quite a lot of you lore junkies out there. But yes, thank you everyone for your time today. Very much appreciated. Please do check in and check out Tom's stuff later on when he's designing Lore Sans banner, because that's going to be awesome. I will try and drop by the chat as well, because I always look forward to watching our sculptors do stuff. It's cool. And I think it's probably on the channel. Have a quick look and see if you can see some of the past stuff, the keynote with Matt, and also the stuff that Russ did, sculpting the alternate Rangosh yesterday, because that was quite spectacular, is the best way I'm going to use to describe it. So thanks very much, everyone. Speak to you soon. Bye.